Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Very fitting to be delivering this here at King's. This is some work that's been undertaken collaboratively between Essex and King's. So my title today is just Manic Temporality, kind of an abbreviated title from what was circulated. I just want to mention this is I've put my name there, but really this is a co-authored piece of work with two King's co-authors, Gareth Owen from IOPPN at the Maudsley and Tanya Gergel. I have to say it's a bit odd. I'm going to use the word we in this paper, but this particular draft is one that they have not yet signed off on, so I'm to blame for this part of it. I also just want to acknowledge that, as you'll see as we get going, there are a number of other research collaborators here who just get numbers in this, but without them, this work would not have been possible. So I suspect we have a fairly diverse audience here in terms of background. So just a couple of things you need to know that before I get going here. I'm going to talk a little bit about inductive reasoning. I expect everybody knows what that is, but basically, you know, this swan goes by and it's white, the next swan goes by and it's white, and eventually I say, hey, the next swan is going to be white. That's an example of what I mean by inductive reasoning. I'm also going to use two terms from Husserl studies, the terms protension and retention. I'll try to explain these when we get to them. But if you think about retention, these are key terms in Husserl's theory of time consciousness. So a kind of classic example, if I clap my hands, you have the primary impression of hearing that sound. But in that little instant afterwards, there's another thing, which is the retention of that experience. It's not a reproductive experience, but you have the experience of it having just happened. Husserl calls that retention, and there's something correlative for the future he calls protension. I've put a motto on here. It's mainly for Sasha. I'm also going to be using a bit of Heideggerian jargon, but don't worry too much about that. I hope it'll make sense as we go on. All right, so here we go. I'm going to be very old-fashioned here. I'm going to read a prepared script, and then we can have a discussion about it. I've put up together some slides, but it's mainly just some key quotes. So symptom scales and diagnostic criteria for mania are peppered with temporally inflected language. Increased rate of speech, racing thoughts, flight of ideas, hyperactivity. But the character of temporal experience in mania remains poorly understood. Even the most sophisticated recent studies tend to rely on concepts that remain unclarified and use research instruments that rely uncritically on spatial representations of temporal structures. For example, one recent European study probing temporal experience in mood disorders asked subjects to report on their experience of the rate of the passage of time. Subjects responded by making a vertical mark on a horizontal line, and the results were reported in millimeters. No attempt was made to clarify the phenomenological structure of the experience that was being reported, and no critical attention was devoted to the risks of distorting temporal experience by imposing spatial metrics. In what follows, we turn to phenomenology in an attempt to gain a deeper understanding of the temporal structures at work in manic experience. Temporal experience has been one of the enduring concerns of the phenomenological movement since its inception, and some of its most important research results have emerged in this area. Husserl's landmark 1905 lectures on what he called internal time consciousness articulated a distinction between an instantaneous now and what, following William Stern, he refers to as Präsenzzeit, the lived present, or present time. In unpacking the phenomenological structure of the experienced present, Husserl identified the twin phenomena of retention and protension, showing first that these are distinct forms of temporal experience, not to be equated with representational memory and expectation, and second, that they play a transcendental role in the experience of what Husserl called temporal objects, that is, intentional objects that essentially unfold in time. His famous central example was hearing a melody rather than simply hearing a series of notes. Heidegger, who had been partly responsible for preparing Husserl's lectures on time consciousness for publication, took Husserl's investigations much further in the direction of what we might call existential time. Like Husserl, Heidegger insisted on a sharp distinction between the abstract notion of the now, an instant, as a dimensionless temporal instant, the temporal analog of a spatial point, and the lived experience of the present. He introduced the term "enpresenting" to refer Gegenwärtigen, to refer to the existentially complex phenomenon in which entities are present to us in virtue of a temporal structure that Heidegger called ecstatic horizontal temporality, in which we find our orientation in a temporally expansive and meaningful present moment, drawing on our past and projecting ourselves into a self-implicating future. That future does not trail off away, as in the standard portrayal of the timeline, but rather comes towards us. In it, we encounter our future selves. These classic 20th century contributions to our understanding of time as a structure of lived experience have been well studied and debated by scholars. Far less familiar are the findings regarding time and temporality from a second phenomenological tradition that developed alongside and interaction with the more familiar tradition of which Husserl and Heidegger were the founding figures. The second tradition comprises what we shall refer to as the clinical phenomenologists, and its leading representatives as regards the phenomenology of time were Eugene Minkowski and Ludwig Binswanger. Both Minkowski and Binswanger were practicing clinical psychiatrists. Both were informed by the writings of Husserl and, in Binswanger's case, also Heidegger. And both explored the hypothesis that what we would now call mood disorders or affective disorders are best understood as disturbances in the specifically temporal structure of experience. In what follows, our aim is to recover and extend this tradition of clinical phenomenological investigation of temporal experience, with particular attention to the experience of manic excitement. The first part of the paper is historical. We identify and explore three key hypotheses regarding manic temporality that were first formulated by Minkowski and then modeled by Binswanger. In the second part of the paper, we set out to test and refine those hypotheses using heterophenomenological data from an interview-based study here at King's of temporal experience in the manic phase of bipolar disorder. We focus on disturbances of temporal experience as manifested in decision-making, deliberation, and assessment of harm. Our conclusions support a central hypothesis due to Minkowski and Binswanger. That is, that disturbance in the formal structure of temporal experience is a core feature of mania. Developing a suggestion from Binswanger, we propose a characterization of this disturbance in terms of the normative texture of manic protension. In making our argument, we also draw attention to evidence that suggests a link between disturbed temporal experience and a distinctive failure of inductive practical reasoning during manic episodes. So a little bit of history, a little bit of phenomenology, and a little bit of logic. Okay, here we go. Let's see if we can fit that in. So section one is called Minkowski's three hypotheses. As a first benchmark in surveying clinical phenomenology, we turn to a seminal case study reported by Minkowski in 1923. The case does not itself involve mania, but it matters for our purposes nonetheless because it records rather vividly the initial framing of a cluster of insights about temporality and mood disorder whose validity we propose to assess. Minkowski recounts an extraordinary episode during which he served as the personal physician to a 66-year-old man suffering from a severe form of depression. The man was besieged by feelings of guilt and lived in continual fear and anxiety, both about his own imminent torture and execution, and about the execution of members of his family. His persistent and distressing delusions included the conviction that all the waste and refuse of the world was to be pumped into his stomach. Minkowski's relationship to this patient was unusual. His duties as personal physician were so arranged that he lived with the man continuously, day and night, for a period of 2 months, apparently in quite intimate quarters. It was during this extended, close interaction and observation that Minkowski hit upon what would become his principal hypothesis. His training had taught him to probe the man's condition by first examining the specific content of the delusional experiences and then endeavoring to trace them back to specific disorders of either perception or judgment. But over the course of their shared residence, Minkowski came to a different conclusion. Where, he asked, is the discordance between the patient's psyche and my own? His answer? The patient's most fundamental disorder was neither perceptual nor judgmental, but temporal. And the most important difference between doctor and patient pertained not to the content of the patient's delusions, but to the form of his temporal experience. Intriguingly, one clue that led Minkowski to this conclusion concerned a distinctive impairment of the patient's reasoning abilities. Each day, in a state of considerable anxiety and fear, the man would insist that his execution would take place that night. Minkowski reports on his own reaction. At first, I consoled myself with the thought that, come the morning, he would see that all his fears had been in vain. However, the same scene was repeated the next day and the next, until after 3 or 4 days, I had given up hope, whereas his attitude had not budged one iota. What had happened? I, as a normal human being, had rapidly drawn from the observed facts my conclusions about the future. He, on the other hand, had let the same facts go by him, totally unable to draw any profit from them, relating himself to the same future. I now knew that he would continue to go on, day after day, swearing that he was to be tortured to death that night, and so he did, giving no thought to the present or the past. Already with this one case report, we encounter a number of the themes that will concern us in what follows. Minkowski's patient suffers from a condition in which his thought processes and affective life fail to track the realities of his situation. That condition itself involves the collapse of a fundamental component of ordinary human reasoning, what Minkowski calls the tendency to generalize, or what we might call inductive reasoning. And all this, Minkowski boldly proposes, is rooted in what he calls, quote, a profound disorder in his general attitude toward the future. Minkowski hazards several descriptions of the underlying disturbance in the patient's lived experience of time. Quote, that time which we normally integrate into a progressive whole was here split into isolated fragments. In another passage, the carryover from past and present into the future was completely lacking in him. The future was blocked or shut off. The mature statement of Minkowski's views is found in his major study of 1933, Lived Time. What is particularly important for our purposes is a short passage in which Minkowski turns his attention to mania. The brevity of this section is surprising. In a book of nearly 500 pages, the discussion of mania occupies only 3. But Minkowski clearly thinks that his approach also gains traction in this context. Quote, in my estimation, the structural analysis of the person in a state of manic excitement will have to be undertaken in this direction. And this all the more so because it allows us to view manic excitement from the same point of view as melancholia, namely as a disorder relevant to the unfolding in time, or, if you wish, as a manifestation of a mental subduction in time. Minkowski's hypothesis is that mania has its roots in the temporal structures of human experience, and specifically in an impairment in the way that time unfolds, that is, in the way in which temporal experience is articulated into a past, present, and future. Borrowing a term from Maurice Mignard, he describes the underlying disorder as a subduction in time, i.e., a modifying of the very form of mental life in a radical fashion, or, in a very controversial passage, a modification to an inferior level. We'll come back to that. As to the specific form that subduction takes in mania, Minkowski proposes the following description. A person in a state of manic excitement lives only in the now, and this is a now which limits his contact with the environment. He has no present anymore, since in general he no longer experiences unfolding in time. For Minkowski, clinical phenomenology must distinguish between a temporally and hermeneutically thin now, an instant, and a thick, expansive, and hermeneutically rich present, Präsenzzeit. Minkowski insists that the specific phenomenological texture of the experience present is always itself a function of the lived future. So if the lived future is lost or distorted under conditions of mania, then the result is a form of experienced temporal presence that has undergone a subduction. We need finally to take note of one further claim advanced in Minkowski's brief remarks about mania. Notice that in the passages just cited, Minkowski claims not only that mania involves living only in the now, but also that this now limits his contact with the environment. In elaborating this idea, Minkowski writes of, quote, the particular shrinking which the manic person's vital contact with reality undergoes, which, without completely annihilating it, renders this contact particularly superficial. In appealing to the notion of vital contact with reality, Minkowski is borrowing from his own famous analysis of what Bleuler had described as the, quote, autistic moment in schizophrenia. In the case of schizophrenia, he had claimed vital contact is lost, resulting in a break into the harmony between ourselves and reality. As regards mania, Minkowski's suggestion is that the disturbance in temporal experience has consequences for this contact with the environment, rendering it superficial without destroying it altogether. Minkowski himself never provided a detailed development of these proposals, but he nonetheless framed a trio of hypotheses of considerable importance for subsequent research. So here they are. These are Minkowski's three hypotheses. To summarize, 1, disturbance in the formal structure of temporal experience is a core feature of mania. 2, persons in states of mania live in the grip of the now, no longer experiencing the usual unfolding of time into a complex present, past, and future. 3, disturbance in the temporal structure of experience limits contact with reality for the person undergoing a manic episode. Okay? You with me? All right, here we go then. Section 2 is called Binswanger's first model. Minkowski described his three hypotheses about mania as suggestions, but his core hypotheses were later developed by his Swiss contemporary and friend, Ludwig Binswanger, who credited Minkowski as being the first to introduce phenomenology into psychiatry for practical purposes. Unlike Minkowski, who wrote about manic experience only in passing, Binswanger devoted 2 books to the subject, and they were separated by over 30 years. He also approached the topic with something that Minkowski seemed to have lacked: detailed knowledge of the phenomenological research on temporal experience undertaken by Husserl and Heidegger. Indeed, we can usefully treat Binswanger's work in this area as an attempt to provide a model for Minkowski's hypotheses, using resources drawn directly from Husserl and Heidegger. In the end, Binswanger provided not one, but 2 such models, one drawing primarily on Heidegger, and one drawing on Husserl. In this section, we examine the first model, returning to the second below in section 4. So Binswanger's Über Ideenflucht, concerning the flight of ideas, was published as a book in 1933, the same year as Minkowski's lived time. Its focus was the so-called flight of ideas that has long been one of the presentations most closely associated with mania. Theoretically, it was profoundly shaped by Heidegger's Being and Time, which had been published in 1927, and which received only a footnote mention in Minkowski's study. The broader strategy of Binswanger's book was to use certain core concepts and strategies from Being and Time in order to describe and articulate manic experience. For our purposes, 3 ideas will be central. The claim that there is a distinctive world-disclosive mood, or Stimmung, associated with manic episodes. The claim that this mood has its own distinctive temporal structure. And the thesis that the temporal disturbance at work in mania can be understood as a narrowing or shrinking in the way in which, in Heidegger's terms, temporality temporalizes itself. We consider each of these 3 points in turn. Binswanger's point of entry for this early investigation was the phenomenon of manic optimism. He distinguishes 2 broad forms of optimism, which he refers to as primary and secondary. The defining feature of secondary optimism is its dependence on some belief or positing of one kind or another. One of Binswanger's examples is Odysseus, whose optimism about getting home to Ithaca derives from his explicit belief that Athena will protect him in fulfillment of her promises. Panglossian optimism rests on the positing that this is the best of all possible worlds. From these various forms of secondary optimism, Binswanger distinguishes manic optimism as a Stimmung, this is one of Heidegger's key terms, as a mood or attunement. Unlike that of Odysseus or Pangloss, it does not rest on any conviction, posit, or belief. And he coins the term Stimmungsoptimismus, optimism as mood, to distinguish it. Then, applying Heideggerian principles, Binswanger holds that the manic mood of optimism is both world-disclosive and temporally structured. How do you describe a mood? The key thing to describe a mood for Heidegger is to describe the world that it reveals to you. That's the key strategy in Being and Time. According to Heidegger, to be in a particular mood is to find oneself in a world with a distinctive texture. Accordingly, Binswanger's analysis of manic experience begins by trying to articulate the texture of the world of the manic optimist. The terms in which he does so are often metaphorical. You find this a lot with Binswanger. There's a level of metaphor he sometimes doesn't get beyond. The manic world is all rosy, cloudless, bright, and wide open. Even at this first stage of the phenomenological articulation, temporal features enter in. This is hardly surprising, insofar as optimism would seem to be an essentially temporal phenomenon, implicating a sense for a future with a distinctive valence. The manic individual, Binswanger observes, always plans, hopes, or expects something pleasing, and has the sense of an unlimited horizon of time. Even death, if it is considered at all, is encountered as a gateway to a further existence. So the manic world is temporally infinite. The second stage of Binswanger's approach again follows a Heideggerian path. Having described these features of the manic mood and its world, he sets out to identify the underlying structures of temporal experience associated with it. His attempt to do so involves a verbatim appropriation of Heidegger's account of the temporal structure of curiosity in section 68 of Being and Time. So Heidegger there is describing a kind of hyper-curious individual who's constantly craving after the newest thing, moving on from one thing to another. Heidegger's curious individual is characterized by a superficial, highly distractible, enthusiastic attraction to whatever proximally presents itself. Adapting a comment from Rilke, Binswanger describes the tempo of manic curiosity as involving a form of leaping, tumbling, and sliding from one thing to another. And following Heidegger, he emphasizes the crucial consequence. Mania brings with it what Heidegger calls Aufenthaltslosigkeit, never lingering or tarrying in a situation, but ever and always leaping off to something new. Binswanger is particularly struck by Heidegger's description of a condition of being at once überall und nirgends, everywhere and nowhere. So for Binswanger, mania is effectively assimilated to an extreme case of what Heidegger calls inauthenticity. The third and final stage in Binswanger's early analysis is also an attempt to follow Heideggerian principles. For Heidegger, the fundamental structures of existence have their deepest origins in the distinctive ways in which, in his notorious jargon, temporality temporalizes itself. The primitive or original structure of temporality becomes articulated or unfolded into the familiar sequential structures of past, present, and future. Binswanger's thesis is that the core phenomenon at work in mania is a disturbance in this temporal articulation. In mania, he claims, the structure of temporalizing is shriveled, geschrumpft, and narrowed into mere impresenting. Even with this much of Binswanger's story in view, it should already be clear that and how Binswanger's position in 33 provides a Heideggerian model for Minkowski's three hypotheses. Minkowski's first hypothesis was that disturbance in the formal structure of experience is a core feature of mania. Binswanger tries to specify just what that disturbance is. Minkowski claimed that the manic individual lives in the grip of the now. Binswanger traces this back to a fundamental narrowing or shrinking in the unfolding of temporal experience. Minkowski claims that one result of these temporal disturbances is a loss of vital contact with reality. Binswanger describes the manic restlessness, which he describes as the most extreme counter-phenomenon to what Heidegger calls the Augenblick, in which we are able to linger and grasp a situation for what it is and respond resolutely. Binswanger's early model of manic temporality is fascinating, not least as a vivid trace of the impact of being in time upon what we might call early adopters from the world of clinical psychiatry. But it's not without its difficulties. Two in particular merit comment at this stage. First, although Binswanger relies heavily on Heidegger's account in elaborating his model, it's not clear that the resulting position makes sense in Heideggerian terms. I think I'll skip over this bit, but it sounds in some of these passages as if the manic individual has only the now. It's like narrowed to impresenting, whereas Heidegger thinks that presence is really a derivative phenomenon. It depends upon the future and the past in order to have that presence. So it's not clear that it really matches up with Heidegger's commitments. A second difficulty is more internal to Binswanger's own commitments, a tension between his starting point and his final position. Here we have to recall that Binswanger's point of entry for the phenomenology of manic experience was manic optimism. Optimism itself would seem to be an intrinsically temporal mood. It's constituted in part by an expectation of good things to come. Moreover, as we noted above, Binswanger himself provides an articulation of some of the distinctive futural structure of Stimmungsoptimismus, including the sense of temporal openness towards an unbounded future. So there's a prima facie problem in accommodating all this within the ultimate conclusion about a form of temporality that somehow shrunk down to mere presence. Neither of these two problems are necessarily insuperable, but in order to resolve them, we would need something that Binswanger's 1933 book did not provide: a more detailed analysis of the structure of the experienced present that predominates in mania. 30 years later, Binswanger attempted to provide exactly that. But this time, he saw the need to supplement his Heideggerian strategies with resources drawn from Husserl's theory of time consciousness. Okay, my third section is called A Very Brief Comment on Protension and Retention. I'm going to skip it because Sherry's going to pull the plug on me at 50 minutes. Those of you who know a little bit about Husserl's time consciousness theory, I've talked to you already about the core idea of retention and protension. Husserl's central examples of that concern what just happened and what's about to happen. And some people have talked about like a 6-second margin in Titchener and so on. And then what he says there is that that form of experience, that experience of what just happened, is non-presentifying. I'm not recounting it again, not bringing it to mind again, but it's experienced as kind of a direct perception of what's just passed. And we draw a distinction here between that idea of a non-presentifying form of experience and its application to the just now and what's just about to happen. So we think that these forms of protension can have a much broader reach. They can go beyond the immediate context that Husserl uses to exemplify them. So what we want to keep our eye out there for is this form of experience of something past and something present that's different from a kind of recollection and explicit expectation. So we'll look at how that plays out in Binswanger's second model. Okay, so section 4 is called Binswanger's second model. With this background in mind, we can now turn to Binswanger's second model, which he develops in his 1960 book on melancholia and mania. The book takes the form of a series of studies intended to provide a unified theory of the two phases of what we would now call bipolar disorder, and which Binswanger describes as, quote, the melancholia-mania antinomic. The two central concepts for our purposes are first the idea of the construction of the present, Aufbau der Gegenwart, and second, the idea of Husserlian protension and retention as what he calls maßgebende intentionale Fäden, normative intentional threads. I'll come to each of these in turn. The first concept, the Aufbau of the present, is a natural development of insights shared by Husserl, Heidegger, and Minkowski. If we think of the now as temporally simple, an instant, the temporal analog of a dimensionless point in space, while the lived present is temporally complex, then we need an account of the temporal constitution of the present, the way it's built up or constructed, the lived present. In providing an account of that Aufbau, Binswanger describes protension and retention as the intentional threads out of which the temporal fabric is woven. Here we are back with metaphor again, Binswanger's favorite domain. Binswanger conceptualizes lived time as a kind of temporal fabric or weave, Gewebes, which makes it possible for temporal objects to appear and indeed mediates our whole relationship to the environment. Protension and retention are then understood to be the major threads, the warp and the weft, so to speak, out of which that fabric is woven. Crucially, Binswanger describes these threads as maßgebende. Here we find another term that resists straightforward translation. The standard dictionary definition is definitive or authoritative. Etymologically, the sense is something like giving the measure or establishing the norm. So perhaps the best translation of maßgebende into contemporary philosophical English would be normative. The substantive thesis is then that temporal experience is built up or constructed in part from a set of protensions and retentions against which experience is measured or assessed. In affective disorders, Binswanger claims, this weaving up of the present becomes distorted. Okay? So if we keep in mind the starting point there, the now is this simple temporal instant, the way we theorize the instant. The lived experience of the present is something that's complex, it has duration, lived experience. So he's trying to give us a theory of the way in which that complex present is built up. And then his thesis is it's built up out of these protensions and retentions, but in these affective disorders, that process gets disturbed or distorted. This is a tantalizing proposal, and one that points toward the possibility of filling the lacuna that we found in his earlier model. If we could provide a perspicuous account of this temporal Aufbau and its disturbances, we'd be on our way towards an articulation of the phenomenological substructure of temporal experience in mania. That's the good news. The bad news is that the promise is never properly fulfilled. One persistent problem is that Binswanger's writings on this topic never break free from these first metaphorical formulations. Binswanger offers a number of suggestive elaborations on this governing metaphor of the temporal fabric, weave, and threads, but the metaphor itself is never fully cached. The more serious problem for present purposes is that Binswanger operates with a number of competing deployments of the metaphor, and these different versions themselves pull in rather different directions. His most frequent elaboration, his kind of official story, is that in conditions of manic excitement, the weave of the temporal fabric undergoes a kind of loosening, Auflockerung. Note that if we take this metaphor seriously, we would have to say that the normative intentional threads of protension and retention remain. They're just not woven together as tightly as in other configurations of experience. One result might be that certain kinds of extended temporal objects simply cannot be experienced. They slip through the gaps in the weave of our temporal fabric, which lacks the degree of continuity needed to capture them. So that's a first use of the metaphor. We have kind of a loose temporal fabric in mania. But in other passages, Binswanger claims that in mania, the temporal threads are torn up into fragments, retreat, or indeed disappear altogether. On this application of the metaphor, the collapse of temporal experience would be more thoroughgoing. If the threads disappear, then surely the fabric goes along with it. But alongside these first two deployments of the metaphor, Binswanger, on one occasion, makes use of a third. Interestingly, the third deployment is the one that is most tightly connected to one of Binswanger's case studies, the so-called case of Olga Bloom. As is often the case with Binswanger's case studies, he sketches the basic facts of the case and then focuses myopically on one tiny detail from one particular episode. In the case of Olga Bloom, the episode involves reading Goethe. At one point during her stay at the hospital, Binswanger gives Olga a copy of Faust Part 1 and invites her to read it. When later asked for her reaction, her response is, quote, "It's a good thing that Goethe has already lived. Otherwise, I would have had to write it." In reflecting upon the significance of this response, the feature that Binswanger finds most significant is not so much Olga Bloom's relief at not having to write Faust herself, but rather the characteristic form of manic optimism reflected in her confidence that she could indeed write it for herself if she had needed to. Binswanger elaborates on this optimism in terms of its protentive structure. The protentive moment emerges from the whole sentence in which Olga Bloom both expressed her relief that the prior existence of Goethe relieved her of the effort of having to write Faust like his, while at the same time harbored no doubt that she would succeed at the task. This is the protension that hangs in the air, since all retentive moments are missing on which she would be able to build. Notice here the third deployment of Binswanger's governing metaphor. What he ascribes to Olga Bloom in this passage is not a loosely woven temporal fabric or a form of experience in which the protensional and retentional threads are torn up. For Olga Bloom, a protension is indeed at work, but it hangs in the air without being interwoven with the correlate retentions. Okay. Section 5 is called 6 patterns. We turn now to introduce some, that's the end of my historical story. I come to the empirical part now. We turn now to introduce some empirical evidence from our interview-based study of manic temporality. Our presentation of findings here is of necessity highly selective. We plan to provide a fuller analysis of the data in another paper. For present purposes, we focus on findings that have the most direct bearing on Minkowski's hypotheses and Binswanger's models. So first, a few words about the design of the study. We undertook an open-ended, qualitative, interview-based study using the technique of second-person phenomenology upon which we've reported elsewhere. We approached research subjects as collaborators and as informants as to the character of their own manic experience. In keeping with Dennett's proposals for hetero phenomenology, we treated their reports as primary data to be interpreted, but did not assume that they were always reliable informants. The participants were 12 individuals selected to have histories of bipolar disorder, to be acutely manic at the point of initial interview, and to be effective communicators of their manic experience. So what did we find? We identified 8 patterns in the interview data that related either directly or indirectly to our core question about temporal experience in mania. We report fully on the 8 patterns elsewhere, but for present purposes, focus on just 6. Before turning to the patterns, however, I think I'll skip this part. I have a few examples. We start by asking them, if you had to explain your manic experience to somebody who had no experience of that, what would you say? And I have some examples here of their descriptions. Maybe we'll just look at one of them. How would you explain your mania to somebody who didn't know anything about that? It sounds very weird and stupid, but Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, you know, when the elevator smashed through the roof, reached the peak, and it's through the roof, through the ceiling? Not nasty, it's like being free. He looked down, and he could see everything, and everything was his. With this by way of background, we turn now to review the 6 relevant patterns. I'll be very brief here. First, all patterns were able to report on past manic episodes, and many were able to do so in considerable detail. Here's one example. It's long, so I'm not going to read the whole thing, but you can see there's quite a detailed reconstruction of what had happened in this past. Remember, we're interviewing him while manic, in hospital, acute mania, and he's recollecting in detail a past episode. All of the research collaborators could do that. Second, participants were able to make reference to concrete future plans. Here we go. Here's an example. I've just got to make sure I pay my TV license this week. Okay? Third, many participants were able to report in some detail on the warning signs of an imminent manic episode. So here's an example. BP2, I always know when I'm going to be manic. Interviewer, you always know? Yeah, I always know because I become happier. I become more inclined to listen to loud music. I tend to buy things. I tend to be jolly on the whole, except when somebody gives me a problem, and then I become very irritable. Quite a fine-grained account of the warning signs. So you know, the interview, you know what the signs are. BP2, I've got big insight, and it's normal. I'm not at the stage where it's the first time in my life that I had a manic episode. I've had manic episodes for 35 years. Okay, so that's the first 3 patterns. Recollection of past episodes, concrete future plans, and then reporting on the signs of imminent mania. Particularly in light of these first 3 patterns, a 4th pattern was particularly striking. All of the participants denied that they were currently in a manic state, despite being hospitalized with a diagnosis of mania. So I'll just give you one example here. BP4, when it comes to bipolar, I'm the king of bipolars. Interviewer, would you say you were in a manic phase now? I got to say, any psychiatrist would say you're in a manic phase now. BP4, no. Interviewer, what phase are you in now? Would you say just a level phase? So he can recall the past, he knows the warning signs, but when it comes to the current present, are you now in a manic state? He says no. A 5th pattern concerns the possibility of future episodes, which participants almost all denied. BP9, I can't even imagine one. This is somebody who has many past experiences, just reported on them. I can't even imagine a future episode. I'm through it. I've not peaked and gone down. I'm in a different arena. This is a new game now. Interviewer. So what you're saying is that all the issues about mania, managing mania, in the past are, BP4, fizzling out. Okay, it's not going to happen anymore. The final pattern that I'll mention emerged in response to more open-ended questions about the future. And I'm just going to give you several examples of these because this is actually the most dominant theme. Interviewer. When you look to the future, do you see pain and suffering or do you see possibilities? 4. No, I see freedom and liberation. Interviewer. So when you think about the future now, how does the future seem to you? 9. It's great, it's golden, it's wonderful. It's going to be full of all the things that I could potentially have, create for myself. I know that my life will be full of abundance if I keep this synchronistic approach. Interviewer, do you have worries about the future? Or do you feel that the future's... No, I don't feel a fear about the future. The future will take care of itself. Finally, what can you see if you look into the future? Palm trees, whitewashed buildings, hot sun, anywhere like that. But not just that, you know, places where I haven't been. This distinctive attitude towards the future, both highly positive and yet also largely inspecific, was the single most prevalent temporal theme in the acute interviews. What light do these patterns shed on Minkowski's 3 hypotheses? We suggest that our data effectively rebuts Minkowski's second hypothesis, if that is indeed understood to mean that persons in conditions of mania live only in the now without awareness of past or future. The participants in our study were severely manic at the time of these acute interviews, but they nonetheless reported and reflected in rich detail on their own past and in both mundane and extraordinary ways on their future. This same evidence casts doubt on Binswanger's first model, at least insofar as its bottom line analysis concerns the hypothesis of a shriveling or narrowing of manic temporal experience in presenting. I'm going to skip the part. We have an error theory about what we think went wrong in those earlier theories, but we can discuss that if people are interested. By contrast, our data does lend support to Minkowski's first hypothesis, that a disturbance in the structure of temporal experience is a core feature of mania. The 6 patterns suggest that there is indeed a distinctive form of temporal experience at work in manic excitement, and that this temporal structure has important consequences, for example, as regards awareness of illness, practical reasoning, and risk assessment. But if the structure of that disturbance is not to be understood as a shriveling to the now, then how should it be understood? Here, our data fits with what we might call the Olga Bloom variant of Binswanger's second model. So I've just taken this passage and put it on the slide. This is our principal conclusion. We hypothesize that the phenomenological core of acute mania lies in a sui generis form of existential pretension of a future with a uniformly positive valence. We propose that this form of manic pretension extends not only to the next few seconds, the about to occur, but has a global significance, projecting a structure for the self-implicating future as a whole. Finally, we propose with Binswanger that manic pretension is in his distinctive sense maßgebende. That is, that it establishes the normative background or standard against which any particular future events are to be understood. To revert to Binswanger's metaphor, this sui generis form of pretension is the dominant thread in the temporal fabric of manic experience. And because pretension is one of the basic constituents for the Aufbau of the lived present, the result is a distinctive form of Präsenzzeit characteristic of mania. In our final section, we consider the impact of this form of presence on manic reasoning, together with its bearing on Minkowski's third hypothesis. So I have a very short final section, if Sherry will let me get away with it. It has Carnap in it, so in that case it's okay, right? Sure. All right, here we go. Final section, section 7, is called Manic Temporality and Existential Logic. There is a classic perspective on inductive reasoning, exemplified by the wartime papers of Rudolf Carnap and Karl Hempel, which treats induction as a strictly formal, wholly syntactic operation. The merits of that account have been vigorously debated among logicians. Even on this classic formal approach, issues about time enter the logical picture, albeit only time of a very particular sort and playing a sharply defined role. Carnap's elusive C function can serve as an example. Sorry, you weren't supposed to see the bottom of that yet. I wanted a slide with both those two things on it at the same time, but you're only supposed to see, ignore, pay no attention to the thing at the bottom. Carnap's elusive C function can serve as an example. According to this top-level formula, the degree of credence that Jones ought to have for hypothesis H is a function of H, the hypothesis, and the evidence available to Jones. But note the occurrence of T on both sides of his equation. What is at stake is Jones' credence with respect to H at time T. The claim is that that's a function of the evidence available to Jones, or should be a function of the evidence available to Jones at T. In other words, the rationality of a particular inductively based belief is always indexed to the evidence available at the time. At which time? In effect, at the instant when a bet is placed. It's crucial to remember, however, that inductive reasoning is not only a matter for formal logic. It's also a phenomenon of lived experience. Considered in this context, induction has a much richer and more complex relation to time. We propose to use the term existential logic to refer to the study of reasoning, including inductive reasoning, as a structure of lived experience. And the key point to recognize here is that existential logic, in this sense, is richly temporal. As a phenomenon of lived experience, induction is all about knitting together my lived past while projecting myself into a lived future. And this holds even if the subject matter of my induction is something long past. Why? Because a lived induction is a way of gathering up evidence from my past experience and using that to project myself into the future, whether by making some explicit prediction or bet, or as a matter of anticipating what future evidence gathering will bring. Viewed from this perspective, we should expect that serious disruptions to the structure of temporal experience will have consequences for a person's inductive abilities. And this is indeed what we find in our data. According to Minkowski's first hypothesis, a disturbance in temporal experience is a core feature of mania, and indeed of affective disorders more generally. On our Olga Bloom variant of Binswanger's second model, the form of that disturbance involves an unspecific but nonetheless dominant pretension of global significance and unqualified positive valence. For someone whose temporal experience is disturbed in this specific way, we can predict that lived induction will be impaired in specific ways. Here it's worth pausing to recall Minkowski's patient with whom we began. Minkowski's patient, the depressed one, experienced a future which was absolutely dominated by the anticipation of imminent torture and execution. Inductive evidence that conflicted with that expectation simply failed to gain any traction in inductive proceedings. In mania, the disruption is inverted. On our hypothesis, temporal experience in mania is dominated by a distinctive global pretension of unspecified but exclusively good things to come. In the words of one participant, yeah, you feel happy, you feel things are working perfect. Like all pretensions, this distinctive manic pretension is, in Husserl's words, determinately indeterminate. In this case, the key moment of determinacy is that everything will be good, everything will work out. Exactly how things will work out so well, particularly in light of behavior that others see as reckless, is left indeterminate. I can do all this stuff, it's going to be great. As Binswanger proposed in the case of Olga Bloom, this sui generis form of manic protension hangs in the air, untethered by retentions that might qualify it. If, indeed, temporal experience is distorted in this way, what would be the consequences for lived induction? Where inductive evidence points towards a conclusion that some particular matter will not be all good, will not work out, we can expect that evidence to resist inductive incorporation, since it conflicts with the pretension. The result may be cognitive dissonance, or else a flat-out refusal to allow that past experience is a reliable guide to the future. Here, recall the words of BP9. This is a new game now, right? The past is no longer a guide to what happens next. Last paragraph. What's common between Minkowski's patient and the participants in our study is, first, a specific disturbance in temporal unfolding, and second, a resulting impairment of inductive reasoning. What we have seen is that the former explains the latter. But there are both similarities and differences between the two cases. When inductive evidence conflicts with melancholic pessimism, the evidence cannot be effectively taken up. And when inductive evidence conflicts with manic optimism, pointing towards a possible negative outcome, that evidence fails to be incorporated within a lived induction. And one crucial consequence is manic temporality produces a catastrophic loss of vital contact with the reality of a risky world. Okay, I'll stop with that. Thank you.
Wow. We have, thank you. We have time for questions. That's fine. If you want to ask a question, please use the microphone so that we can all hear and it goes into the recording.
Very, very interesting. And as a clinician, I can certainly recognize many of those features of some kind of disruption of temporality. I've got a number of questions. How do some of the other features, like flight of ideas, which is so prominent in mania, hyperactivity, how do they fit within? And what about mixed affective states, which are very common, which is at the same time a mixture of a lot of manic features, so the hyperactivity, the drivenness, there may be some optimism, but there may also at the same time be a sense of depression, of hopelessness. And the phenomenology of both clinical states seems to be present at the same time in varying admixtures, and some people are quite consistently mixed with their various episodes. So I'm wondering how they fit in with temporality, which makes me wonder, why do you put temporality at the core? You know, people traditionally put mood at the core. If I feel great,
good,
then the future looks great, you know, the world looks great, I'm great, everything's great. Why should temporality be put at the core, if this is what you mean by the core, rather than the traditional notion of mood?
Good, good, good. I want to hear all your questions, George. Thank you for those three, but let's start with those three so I don't forget them. Thank you. Those are very, very helpful questions. On the second one about mixed affective states, I don't have anything to say. I would love to hear it if you have thoughts. I mean, the studies that we have conducted here really selected out, we were really looking for pure extreme conditions of mania, and that kind of mixed state then just didn't really show up in these transcripts. So I wouldn't want to speculate about that. But the other 2 points that you raise are very, very important. So, I mean, first of all, I want to just clarify we're supporting Minkowski's hypothesis, and the way we're putting it is one of his ways of putting it, Binswanger's ways of putting it as well, is that a kind of disruption of temporal experience is a core feature of mania, a core feature. We don't mean to exclude the possibility that there might be other core features of mania. We're claiming that this is one. And we're following a pattern of reasoning there that really Minkowski pioneers all the way back in that 1923 study. Insofar, if you can show that other disturbances, other patterns and presentations can be explained by reference to a feature, then to that extent you're licensed in calling it core. And if there are quite a number of presentations that can be shown to be reflected in that feature, then that's more evidence. It's accumulating evidence that it's core. But you ask a really good question. Why not see mood or affect as the core, or at least the predominant thing? So here we have to be careful. I mean, really here there's a Heidegger idea. Sasha will know, is really one of Heidegger's key ideas in Division 2 of Being and Time is that moods are temporal. Moods have a kind of temporal character to them, and in order to understand what a mood is, you need to trace out its temporal features. So let's just suppose that we just thought of moods as lacking that feature, as just elevated feeling, for example, and not having any temporal structure, and we postulated that as core. You say, when I feel really good, everything seems good, right? Why can't we postulate that? The key thing is, for the patients, the participants in our study, it was not the case that everything seemed good. When they reflected on the past, they could tell all kinds of stories of woe. So it was not the case, so there was an asymmetry there between past and future. So an untemporalized notion of mood would not explain the phenomena here. So in its place, what we suggest is you need to build in, it's not temporality as opposed to mood. They're really the same. You think of optimism as a temporal mood. It has a temporal structure. And it's only insofar as you follow that Heideggerian lead, build the temporality into the account of what the mood is, as having an essential place, that you can explain the phenomena. So it's temporally inflected moods that we're positing here as the core phenomenon. I'd be fascinated to hear what you think about that. Flight of ideas, the other question you posed, your first question, what about other presentations, flight of ideas, hyperactivity? Again, I'd be interested to hear your own thoughts about that. But there I feel like Binswanger's first model was kind of on the right track. I feel like he went wrong at the, when he kind of bottomed out with his core temporal analysis there in the first model. But remember, he's assimilating it to Heideggerian curiosity. And so there's what in this is this tempo of manic experience is such that leaps from one thing to another. So the temporal structure there is one that then manifests itself in flight of ideas, hyperactivity, distractibility, those sorts of presentations.
Right.
Oh, give him the microphone so we can. We don't want to miss what George says.
It's not that important.
Says you.
I'm not sure how flight of ideas, pressure of talk, hyperactivity, sleeplessness, sense of denying fatigue when it's clearly present, how I can't quite see the connection with temporal. I can see you're making a good case for the past being seen differently from the present and the future when somebody is feeling great. Because it doesn't mean that my past, in fact, it's in contrast with my past.
Right.
Now everything is so great.
Good. Okay.
But those other features, I'm still not convinced.
Good.
And I still think that the problem of the mixed state, and I'm not quite sure how it would play out here, I think is important in developing your theory.
Great. Thank
more
you. I'm going to
fully.
take note of that. More work is needed, especially to address the mixed state. But I agree. We're not claiming here to have explained every presentation associated with mania. And I think you're quite right. I think more work needs to be done there to think about how those other presentations reflect temporal structure. Thank you for those comments.
Great, thank you, and that was fascinating. So, I'm very sympathetic, for obvious reasons, to this kind of program, but I was trying to think of what one might say from the outside, so to speak, and I guess I had two concerns, which one leads on to the other. So, what seems very clear is this idea of unqualified positive valence. That seems evidently convincing. So, first question is, why do you analyze that in terms of pretension? So you talk about a sui generis notion of pretension, and I guess one worry is that the things they seem to be pretending on your account are often events far in the future. They seem to be events with quite detailed semantic content. So, for example, in the Olga Bloom case, why is that not an unjustified and ungrounded belief about her own competence as a writer? Why call it a pretension? So the worry is these sui generis pretensions seem quite different from normal pretensions. Now, it's not just a terminological issue, because that means someone might come along and say, well, why don't we talk about them as ordinary beliefs? These people have some sort of problem forming evidentially sound beliefs about the future. So that's the sort of initial step. And then a second worry that came to mind is, and obviously I haven't seen all the data, is that despite what you just said about the past, at least with the description of the guy who went into the shop naked, it seemed as if his description of the past was also highly idealizing. So his account of how at the start we were in love and everything was fantastic and nothing was wrong and we went out every night and it was all perfect, and then suddenly one day. And it seems that at least there you could suggest a similar story relating to past events as well. The problem, again, is not anything about pretension specifically. It's a general inability to form evidentially sound beliefs because he's forgetting counterexamples, he's forgetting problems, he's forgetting all the times they sat at home and ate dinner or all the times they had fights. If you put those two things together, you've got a picture on which the basic issue isn't time, the basic issue is some kind of judgment impairment. And then that seems to run against the explanatory direction you want at the end. So whilst it would be true that these disorders, the things you're picking up on, are coextensive with failures of inductive logic, it's not that the temporal stuff explains the failures of inductive logic, it's rather the converse. It's because these people are very bad at forming evidentially sound beliefs that they have evidentially unsound beliefs about the future and also at times about the past. But what's doing the work is some sort of judgmental failure rather than a temporal failure. And I understand when you say temporality is a core feature, I take it you don't just mean it's one of many important features that we need to identify, but you mean something stronger than that. You mean in some sense it has explanatory priority. So to go back to what you said at the start, the insight of Minkowski and Binswanger was that temporality, these weren't judgmental or perception issues, they were temporal issues. And I guess, yeah, you can see how someone might say, well, this doesn't really look like pretension. These people seem to have a wide variety of epistemic failings. Why isn't the real problem here judgment? And that's driving then the temporal stuff rather than the converse.
Wow, good, okay. That's a lot and very rich, thank you. I'm just going to pause just for a second to make sure I at least try to capture it, all of it. Okay. So first of all, as George will certainly know, other clinicians who may be here, the past, and including that guy who talks about going naked to the shops, it's not an idealized past. Right. These participants have suffered really, really terrible harms, and they know it. In fact, some of them are real advocates for coercive interventions in psychiatry. Because they say, you know what, I will do so much damage to myself in these conditions. I know from the past what happens. One of the participants in the past. He was really into music. He had a vast record collection and really nice audio equipment. And then in this manic moment, he just invited all the drug dealers from the street to just come up to his flat. And everything was gone, the next morning. And the guy who walks, naked to the shops, it has a really bad ending, and he tells us about it. So maybe we should include some of that in the story. It's also, remember, one of the things places Minkowski goes wrong, he says it's a failure to generalize. It's not a failure to generalize. In fact, a lot of these patients, research participants, were really good at generalizing. They could generalize over their past experience in order to distill some of the common features that they know are the trigger, the signs about here comes another episode. And then even while they're manifesting them, what they fail to do is to apply that general knowledge to the future. So it's not a general failure. It's not even a general failure of induction abilities, because one form of induction is just forming a generalization. It's a specific failure to apply that knowledge, all about that moving from the past into the future, that core kind of Heideggerian phenomenon of gathering up the past and using that to project myself forward into the future. That's where the specific failure lies. Now, you're right. We're advancing a thesis here about explanatory priority, but as I was trying to say also to George, that doesn't mean we're trying to explain everything. So we want to call it a core feature. That form of words is important to us. It's a core feature. Why is it a core feature? Not because it explains everything, but because it explains a number of things. So I just mentioned 3 here that we think it helps, that our hypothesis helps explain. One is this, this is in a way the most dramatic feature from the data, this asymmetry between recognition of past illness and this confidence across the board, all of them denying future illness. We think we can explain that on this hypothesis. Why? Because I'll come back to your doubts about whether it's protension or not, but if you grant our hypothesis for the moment, I've got this protension determinately indeterminate. I don't know what's going to happen, but I know it's going to be great. So if it's going to be great, and I know that being in a manic episode ends badly for me, I know this can't be a manic episode. So there's a second feature, not only the denial of future illness, but the denial of present, what we call a failure of insight, a very distinctive form of failure of insight in mania here that's presented in the data and is explained by our hypothesis. And then the third thing that's explained is unbelievably bad risk assessment. I mean, this is one of the things that notoriously persons in conditions of mania are very poor at, and this has real important implications for the law, what the law calls using and weighing information in making a judgment. We think that also, as I was trying to say at the end, insofar if we posit this form of global pretension of a future with a uniformly positive valence, then you know what? There is no risky behavior, because everything, and people do, crazy things. They jump out of windows. They invite the drug dealers up, and they're confident. So those are 3 features of manic presentation that we think are explained if you posit this form of protension. So it's a conditional conclusion. But then, just to come to your last point, or at least the last one of your several good points that I remember, is it really protension? I mean, this is a kind of a technical Husserl matter. For Husserl, there's a difference between expecting something in the future. So I expect we're going to get to go to the pub, I can imagine what it's going to be like when we get there. That's a kind of a rational expectation of the future, as opposed to protension. The kind of classic Husserlian example of a protension is you're playing 3 blind mice on the piano, and you stop midway through, and I have this protension of the next note that we'll play. I hear it. It's a future thing. It's not the same as hearing it in a primal presentation, but I hear it. It's a non-presentifying form of futurity. Now, here I just want to admit, our research methodology is not powerfully suited, not well suited to distinguishing whether these intentional acts are presentifying or not. You'll know the key question as to whether it's a pretension for Husserl is whether it's presentifying, whether it makes, whether it's a representing of the content, whether something is present to mind in the present. So what happens for us is, of course, we ask people questions, and they respond. So in responding, they verbalize, they presentify, and so on. So it's difficult for this particular research methodology to distinguish between presentifying and non-presentifying forms of intentional acts. So that proposal was really Binswanger's proposal in the second model. I mean, there is some indirect data in the transcripts that supports it. So for one thing, this is one of the patterns I didn't mention. A lot of them talk about a feeling for the future. It comes up again and again and again. I have a certain sort of feeling. And when they're talking about engaging in some of these really risky behaviors, I just had this feeling it was going to be good. So you might take that as supporting evidence. But it's indirect, I agree. So I would say our conclusion takes this conditional form. If we posit with Binswanger this kind of pretension, if we take his Olga Bloom variant of the hypothesis, then it has explanatory import as regards at least those three presentations.
So do you want to just very quickly? Yeah, just that's really helpful. Thank you. I mean, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it also seems from the outside that it wouldn't, in the end, be a terrible problem if it were to be the case that these mental states are some sort of distinctively future-focused inductive problem that isn't pretentive but has various, is like a belief but has various distinctive features of indeterminacy or imminence or something like that. I mean, it doesn't seem as if that would be a big issue, but I find what you say to make it push it towards
also maybe something we can talk about further at the pub. There's something about its global character too. I know, of course, we can make global claims. You use the universal quantifier, right? For every future event, it's going to be a good thing. But I mean, especially in, there is a historical link between a kind of global structure and something that's has a more intuitive form. So I realize this is not conclusive evidence, but it does fit.
I mean, something that might be an interesting, control case in some sense would be to compare the factors you're picking up on the transcripts here with, say, when people are, non-clinical subjects are asked questions like, how do you believe the future will be for your children, or something like that. So when you have these large-scale opinion surveys.
Yes, it would be interesting to try to design an experiment. It's so easy to do it in here and so hard to actually implement it in reality. It's so difficult. I mean, it's actually not an accident that Minkowski only has 3 pages on this. The psychiatric literature, even in the phenomenological tradition, on depression is huge. But mania is really difficult to study for lots of reasons. But one could try to, it would be an interesting exercise to try to devise a research program that would be able to distinguish as to whether it's a presentifying or non-presentifying.
I mean, if I think that my children will have a better life than me, is that also a pretension in your terms, or is that a belief? And if so,
we don't know. The question as to whether it's pretentive or not depends on on the intentional act, which is different from, you're just specifying a content there. So I can expect that there's going to be another note in this melody, or I can pretend it. I can have that experience. I believe there was just a sound, right? It has propositional content, and I representify that sound as happening, or I can retain it. Husserl talks very provocatively about it, an immediate perception of the past, not bringing it present again, but not mediated by a current perception or a content, but rather an immediate perception of its pastness.
Thank you.
Good, I was hoping you might.
So I'm going to pretend that I'm a flat-footed analytic epistemologist. And what strikes me is something that Sasha partly brought up is, ignoring evidence. So in the first case, the guy, this thing has happened, you know, whatever, 10, 15 times before. This very thing he's predicting is ignoring the fact that his prediction failed. So so I kept saying, are we explaining the ignoring of evidence by something temporal? And in the remarks that you just made, you had a suggestion that you hadn't said in the talk, which was something like this. There are inductions that they're not doing. This is how I understood what you were saying. So the mood has a temporal quality because it is an expectation. It gives you this sort of expectation about the future. It's a generic one. It's indeterminate, whatever. And what I think you just said is that it sort of acts to block certain inductions. It would be neat to see more about how that works, how this generic expectation blocks inductions. Because blocking inductions isn't necessarily an illegitimate thing to do. Okay, so take the swan case. You know, you see all the swans you've seen are white, so you induce all swans are white. But actually, if you knew that within species there can be color variations, you would know you actually shouldn't do that induction, you know. So there are legitimate ways for inductions to be crossed. And that might be a way to think about what they're doing.
Good.
I don't know if that's
Yes, thank you. Thank you. One of the things I cut out of this draft of the paper is a section on cognitive dissonance. And there are some of the interviews, one in particular, where this induction blocking, you kind of catch it in the act. I'm not going to try to reproduce it off the cuff here. Maybe when we upload it, we can put a link to that bit of the transcripts. Where it's one of these exchanges where somebody who has really very articulate knowledge of the warning signs is nonetheless very confident that she's not currently manic. But then it's interesting, actually, this maybe relates to Sasha's point too about whether it's pretension or not. Because the thing is, once you ask her about it, then it becomes articulated in propositional form. And so you might hypothesize that at that point it becomes more accessible to rational criticism. So she's in the sort of full course of this characteristic kind of induction blocking. And then you can see her starting to hesitate because she realizes, wait a second, I am talking really fast, and I have been listening to the music really loud, and all of these sorts of features. So, you know, it requires a lot of interpretation, and there are different ways you could interpret it. But that's another one. We have in BP9 she's assimilated her experience very thoroughly in terms of a kind of New Age metaphysics. And this is very common. You also find quite a lot of theological language in these in the transcripts. And so for her, there is this idea that this is a new age now. And of course, that's articulated as a proposition, but our hypothesis, its underlying structure is as a feeling. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Anyway, that doesn't really answer your question. But is it? We'll have to stretch pretty far to assimilate it to a case where, it would be good to know more about rational induction blocking. I agree. That's an important phenomenon. And so we should look in more detail at what the characteristics of rational induction blocking are. My hunch is those features are not reproduced here, but I don't know enough about it in order to say. Yes, indeed, agreed.
I don't know whether you found this, but actually establishing a conversation with people who are manic is very difficult. Maybe that's why there are only 3 pages, because
Yeah.
the experience that I've had is that once you start challenging a person's views, they become irritable, angry, or think, God, you're so stupid, you're not worth talking to, and the conversation ends. So that I've never had what I would call a rich conversation, which has been rich in terms of elucidating the experience of the person and how they see it. Because normally one challenges particular views and judgments, as you pointed out, and they're very difficult to do with patients with mania. Not so difficult with depression. Maybe that's why much more is written about depression. I think that's a limiting factor on that's a problem from the research design point of view. On the point of judgment, I think that's what you were saying is right, but the judgment's always in one direction. It's always in the positive, it's all good, it's never bad. Has been in the past, maybe. So I think that...
Can I just speak to the first point? There is, as you know, in the Maudsley Reader of Phenomenological Psychiatry, there's a lovely little lecture that Binswanger gave in '64 when he visited Lexington, Kentucky. Actually, all this mania literature from Binswanger is not translated. Most of it never got beyond a first. It's really kind of been lost. But at least it's not lost, but it's not received much attention. But there is this lecture from '64 where he gathers some of the material from the 2 books, actually, and presents them there in this English lecture. I really recommend it. It's a really lovely piece of writing. He's a really good writer in lots and lots of ways. But actually, he does say it's this seminar with all these psychiatrists in '64, and this sort of existential psychiatry, man, it's the exciting new thing. And he says, this is your challenge. You imagine this German, This is your challenge, is to establish the relationship with the person. And it's going to be really, really hard when it comes to these manic patients. It's a really very, very difficult case. So here I have to say, partly it's down to the talent of my co-author here who did the interviews, Gareth Owen, but also I think it also has to do with the research design. It really did create a space, and we really should try to publish as much of this as possible, I think. The Wellcome Trust is offering us a facility where we can upload a lot of there's a lot of it, hundreds of pages. But it really did become possible in the best of those interviews to escape that combative thing. And partly it was, hey, you are our research collaborator. We're not in any way there's an important lesson there, actually, I think. I mean, I know that this is an important part of your practice as well as a psychiatrist. So I feel like we were incredibly lucky or not lucky, I mean, the talent of Gareth is a key part of it, to avoid some of that confrontation and to get really rich and productive. So again, I just want to thank those 12 people as well as Gareth for the work that they did to make that possible.
It's really just a following on from that, but I guess I'll be just sitting on the question and walking away without really having articulated it. It was just this sense of what kind of investigator, you happen to show up as you're interviewing these 6 people of the 12. Is that right?
There were 12.
12 in total, 12. Yeah. So, for me, there's one kind of investigator or phenomenological inquirer who would be taking from the transcripts, and seeing them as direct reports of something. But maybe another way is of acknowledging something more reflexive going on, so that it's more hermeneutic. The person is talking about the experience, but in what context, in what setting, in the hospital, with me. They're expressing themselves in a certain way with me, and I'm part of the dialogue. So to what extent do I then become, it's just a concern I have on my part, I guess. Whether there's something that starts to inform, this whole investigation in terms of my role in it.
Yes, good, thank you. So a couple of points, some of them technical. Part of our methodology here, we call it Hetero Phenomenology. Your kind of classic phenomenology is reflective, the first-person case, and actually our work in this is always informed by that as well. What's it like to engage in, and what is induction as a lived experience for me? but this is hetero phenomenology. It's about trying to get at the experience of somebody else. And that's actually fairly unusual in the mainstream kind of phenomenological tradition. There's a lot of talk about alterity in kind of Husserl and Levinas and so on, but what they're talking about is my experience of you as another person, as opposed to what we're talking about, which is your experience, right? So what we're talking about, second person phenomenology, is something different from that kind of alterity literature in the phenomenological literature. And then here, we're taking a page from Dennett, in particular in his old book, Consciousness Explained, from the 90s, where he coins this term, I think it's his term, hetero phenomenology. And his methodology says there is, don't take the reports as a glimpse into, their data, and it has to be interpreted. I think Dennett's mainly interested in the operations of the brain. We're interested in the structures of lived experience. And then you have to take that data combined with the presentations and so on, and its hermeneutic to try to figure out what it means. I had a good example in mind, it slipped right now, where it's a case of somebody, what they said is clearly not exactly true. Anyway, it's escaped me now. So that's just a technical point about the methodology of the research. But then your other point is really about this moment of reflexivity in the interviews and the situation. And there, this collaboration we've been at a few years with George's help and Gareth and others at the Maudsley. Actually, I think there's quite a long history of this at the Maudsley, of this collaboration between phenomenology and psychiatry turns out to be really, really fertile in my experience. And one of the things I, as a phenomenologist, have learned from the psychiatrists is pay attention to your own experience in the interaction with the interview subject. That's not something that ever really comes up. I mean, Husserl talks endlessly about his method. He never mentions that, right? And it turns out to be so important. And if you think back to what Minkowski said at the beginning, what does he say about that guy back in 23? His way of posing the question is as much about him as it is about the patient. What's the difference between me and him? So to see that as a really dyadic kind of relationship, I think that's, as well as just the toolkit that psychiatrists come with, their day job is, at least the best of them, is getting at the experience of the other person to try to bring it out into the open for articulation and discussion. There's a whole set of techniques for that. I think that's a really powerful alliance, a real, so this is a really richly interdisciplinary area of research. And of course, it's also crucial to emphasize here, philosophy, psychiatry, and what we call experts by experience, the people who can really be articulate in communicating that.
Can we make a few announcements before we leave for today?
You want a microphone to make announcements?
There's a philosophy of psychiatry is a very active area right now at King's. So, for example, we have a reading group going on Fridays that's about explanation in psychiatry, and you can find out about that on our website, philosophyandmedicine.org. So there's one tomorrow, and you can find the link to the reading. Also, we have a new MA program in philosophy of medicine and psychiatry. It's a program in the philosophy department. Lots of modules available, including concept of mental disorder, mental health law, mental health ethics. The deadline for applications is March 31st, so if you are interested, get onto our website and find out more about it. Now, a different topic. The next colloquium, 2 weeks from today, same time, same place, will be about the ethics of information privacy in using health data. And that's James Wilson from UCL. So we hope to see you there or here.
You don't really mean that. That's his 2nd of March. But
Oh,
isn't
it's
today
16th.
the 2nd
No,
of March?
yeah, oh, sorry. Thank you. You know how I make these slides. Yeah, 16th of March, so 2 weeks from now. And I hope to see you then, here. Finally, thanks again to Wayne, and thank you all for coming tonight. Thanks.